threat was that credible, that specific, that there was no option for them to do this.
And let's just touch on the insane story from the United States regarding Donald Trump and that ruse to get him off Air Force One and onto another plane because of a threat to his life. I'll sum it up really quickly for our listeners who I'm sure may have heard a little about this already. President Trump flew to the NATO summit in Turkey on the new Air Force One donated by Qatar. When he left Turkey, he said he wasn't going to get the Qatari plane home. He was going to get the original Air Force One home for sentimental reasons, he said. He was seen getting onto the old powder blue Air Force One. What we didn't know, and what journalists on that plane didn't know, is that before takeoff he was smuggled off that plane into a catering truck and put onto a smaller plane with Pete Hegseth because there was an Iranian threat to his life. That's quite a dramatic ruse. Take us inside that story, Roger, from your experience and your dealings with Iranian threats. What might Donald Trump have received? We've not had specific details, I suppose, for obvious reasons. But what sort of might have provoked that?
So first and foremost, my understanding is that there had been an Israeli warning of a credible Iranian plot to shoot down Air Force One using shoulder-launched missiles, likely as it was taking off. Now for them to do all of this theater, as people would call it, it's a real sign that if this reporting is accurate, they could not take the risk on this. That the threat intelligence provided to the Secret Service and to the US, that was against Trump personally, and it was so credible and specific, not just generic, we're going to do this, we're going to manage this, we're going to shoot you down. It's a notable escalation in how seriously Washington is treating these direct threats to the president, and not just US assets or personnel within the region. But it does fit a wider pattern since February, and we all know that IRGC, and specifically the Quds Force elements, have been signaling their intent to reach beyond the battlefield. And this is consistent with what we're seeing in sort of threat reporting against US officials, against public figures that are tied to the Iran fire more broadly.
So sorry, Roger, just take me to that. So there had been, as you understand it, missiles were going to target Donald Trump aboard Air Force One. He was in Turkey. Where would those missiles come from?
Well, what it says, it's looking at the information that I've been picked up listening from CNN, was that it was shoulder-launched missiles. Therefore, they were actually in Turkey, probably very close to the...
shoulder-launched missiles.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, again, this is single-source reporting that I've picked up by CNN. It could be right, could be wrong. We will never really know. But the threat was that credible, that specific, that there was no option for them to do this, but some sort of almost sort of theatrical, macabre type of move, not just on one aircraft. They moved into a smaller aircraft to get to the UK, and then UK he was changed again before heading back to the US. So it was a very complex and rapidly planned and executed move by the Secret Service to keep him safe.
Well, look, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you. Roger McMillan, who is a defence and security analyst. Good to speak to you again, Roger. Thank you. Donald Trump secretly switched aircraft on his way back from last month's NATO summit in Turkey after an Iranian threat was made against his life. Two senior US military officials say security services warned him against flying on the new Qatari-donated Air Force One jet as a precaution following a resumption of hostilities between Washington and Tehran. Let's bring in Paul McCleary, national security reporter for Politico. Paul, good evening.
Hi, how are you?
How severe does a threat from Iran have to be for a president to go to such elaborate measures, sneaking onto another plane via a catering truck, to go to that extent? How serious does the threat have to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty dramatic set of events here where, as you said, the president got onto one plane, got into a catering truck, was sneaked into another plane. The threat had to be pretty serious. And I know before the Ankara summit, folks in the government, the White House, were advising the president not to take this Qatari plane. It's not hardened. It doesn't have all the communications and air defenses and things like that that Air Force One has. So he'd used it domestically a few times, but he was told he shouldn't use it internationally. But Donald Trump's going to do what Donald Trump wants to do. So he took it to Turkey, and obviously it didn't work out the way they had thought. I mean, the bombing campaign had just resumed as well. So I think between the Iranian threat, probably just some domestic terrorist threats that Turkey lives with kind of on a daily basis, it was deemed he couldn't fly it home.
So if it was an issue with the Qatari donated plane and that not being secure enough, he then got onto the original Air Force One plane, and I know that that's the name for all the president's planes, but in this instance, let's just call it his original powder blue Air Force One plane. But then he got off that and onto another plane. So if it was an issue with the Qatari jet, why didn't he just stay on the original Air Force One?
Well, the original Air Force One would have been the target, right? If there were going to be some sort of Iranian action or terrorist action to try to shoot the plane down or somehow intercept it, that Air Force One would be the target. So he got on.
So it wasn't it wasn't an issue with the security of the Qatari plane. It was a threat to Trump, regardless of what he was traveling on.
The Air Force One, the original Air Force One, can defeat most threats, most likely. But I think they just thought that maybe the threat was enough that they didn't even want to take that chance of him getting on this plane, just because it was so announced, it was in the news what time he was getting on the plane, and normally we know generally, but it's not, down to the minute when he's leaving. So I think there's more visibility on it.
And then he got onto a separate plane via a catering truck, got onto a separate plane with Pete Hegseth, and he made, I know, a brief landing in the UK at RAF Mildenhall. What does this tell us about how real the military threat between Washington and Tehran actually is right now behind the scenes?
Oh, it's pretty real. I mean, when you see the president at golf courses lately, there's some Avenger air defense systems on the golf courses near him. I mean, I think that the Iranians have threatened Trump for years, as with most other American politicians and presidents. But I think with the war going on now, the Iranians with their proxies, I think the threat is heightened, right? And I think Trump loves things like the NATO summit or G7, so he was going to go no matter what. He's the star of the show. It was going to happen against the advice, I think, of a lot of his advisors. But then they had to go through these elaborate precautions to put him on 3 different planes in order to get him home.
He left journalists on the original Air Force One. He said, by the way, he was travelling on it for old times' sake. But we now know he didn't travel on it. But he did leave some White House staff and journalists aboard. They were told to keep their window shades down, which they did question. Would the White House be liable if something had happened to those journalists and those staff aboard the original Air Force One?
I mean, yeah, I think, we do these trips. I've been on trips like this. You sign waivers and you sign certain things away, right? Your security's in their hands, but nothing's 100%. So, but yeah, I mean, if they're using them as a decoy, essentially, for Iranian missile attack, I think that opens up a whole new can of worms that isn't normal for a normal Secretary of Defense or presidential trip.
Yeah, because as far as the Iranians knew, Trump was on that original Air Force One. Look, really interesting to speak to you. Thank you. Paul McCleary, national security reporter for Politico. Great to have you with us.